Good morning, happy Friday, and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. I am so excited to be joined by an old friend of mine, Kevin Walling.
It's great to see you, Amber. It's been a little while. It's awesome to be on the new set with you.
Yes, very glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Well, Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris attended a flashy star-studded campaign event in Michigan Thursday night, hosted by Oprah Winfrey, called Unite for America. Just a month and a half ahead of the presidential election, live audience members had the chance to ask Harris questions that are on their minds as they prepare to cast their vote for the presidency in November. Winfrey hosted the event with activist group Win with Black Women, which is aimed to register people to vote in key states like Georgia, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. The event brought together over 100 groups online that have rallied behind the vice president over the last few months, such as White Dudes for Harris, Cat Ladies for Kamala, Latinos for Harris, and many more. A slew of celebrities also joined virtually, including Meryl Streep, Jennifer Lopez, and Chris Rock.
While the conversation between Oprah and Kamala Harris left many in the audience in tears, literally, many online felt like Harris did not offer any concrete policy proposals and instead dodged questions and gave some rambling responses. Here's what she had to say when asked about her, quote, specific steps that she would take to, quote, strengthen the nation's southern border.
The United States Congress, members of the Congress, including some of the most conservative Republicans, came up with a border security bill. And here's what that border security bill would have done. It would have put 1,500 more border agents at the border.
Oprah, a registered independent who endorsed Harris at the Democratic National Convention last month, interrupted and seemed to call out Harris for her response.
What does leadership really look like? And is it about you or is it about the people? Right. Is it about running on problems or fixing problems? My work and my career has always been about saying, let's fix problems. Let's address the needs, because we know it's within our capacity to do that.
So to answer Justin's question, now that that bill has gone and hasn't passed, will you reintroduce that?
Absolutely.
Harris also got some flack online for what she had to say about her ownership of a gun.
I'm in favor of the Second Amendment, and I'm in favor of assault weapons bans, universal background checks, red flag laws. And these are just common sense. These are just common sense.
I thought it was so powerful at the convention when you said you have guns. No, at the debate.
I'm a gun owner. Tim Walz is a gun.
I did not know that.
If somebody breaks in my house, they're getting shot.
Yes. I hear that. I hear that.
Probably should not have said that. But my staff will deal with that later.
Yeah. But of course, she couldn't let the night end without throwing some zingers Trump's way.
Part of my plan is to give startup small businesses a $50,000 tax deduction to start up their small business. Right now it's $5,000. Nobody can start a small business with $5,000. So that's part of my plan.
That's a teeny tiny business.
That's a business in
teeny tiny business.
It's a concept of a business, right?
So Amber, what did you think of that interview last night with Oprah?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I feel pretty in line with what some of the internet commenters, as we called them, said, which is...
They've been busy.
Yes, they sure are. Yeah, I mean, it was pretty light on specific policy proposals, which unfortunately I think has been sort of the standard bearer for the Kamala campaign. And even on the debate stage just a few weeks ago, I think that would have been her first real opportunity to provide some of those specifics. And I don't know that voters left that debate feeling any more like they really know what Kamala is going to do if she becomes president. It's a lot about tone and character, which is fine, but when you're running a presidential campaign, you should also probably tell them what kind of policies you're going to implement.
And that's certainly been one of the biggest knocks, I think, against the Harris campaign is the lack of, and we're going to talk about this later in the show, the lack of direct media interviews, although she participated in some panels this past week. But that certainly has been an attack line for Republicans and conservative media, that she isn't making herself available to the scrutiny of the media. I thought one of the biggest takeaways was that line about guns. They got the audience engaging and cracking up, and that has seemingly been one of the biggest takeaways coming out of that interview.
It's interesting. I wonder if that's something that could potentially rankle the progressive base a little bit, because
She was certainly a little bit more tough on crime last night.
I know.
In that conversation.
I mean, she said before, back in when she was running for the Democratic primary in 2019, that she wanted to ban assault weapons. I think she still supports that position.
And she doubled down on that in the
Right,
interview. Yep.
and has, but I think in the past she's been a little bit tougher on guns. I know she said before that she owns one. I think she said it in the debate, actually. I did reach out to her campaign and ask what kind of gun she owns.
That's a great
and
question,
if she has
actually.
more than
Yeah.
one. I have not heard back.
Okay. Well, you heard it here. If you're watching on Air Force 2 right now, before you head to Atlanta, please give us a call and let us know what kind of firearm that is. But I think this is also part of this kind of larger strategy in terms of, there is a hunger for more information about the vice president, Amber, to your point, where, she's still an unknown quality to a lot of Americans. Coming out of the debate, they saw record numbers. I think 68 million or so folks tuned into that debate. And I think this is still part of this almost reintroduction effort by the Harris campaign with a friendly endorser, right, in Oprah, who is the best when it comes to these kind of short form interviews in front of an audience. But certainly that hunger persists, I think, among the American people, looking for more specifics from the vice president's team.
Yeah, and the numbers back up the idea that they want to know more. I mean, ahead of the first debate, I believe it was 40% said that they needed to know more about who Kamala Harris was and what she intended to do as president. And then following the debate, we just had a Gallup poll come out this week with the approval ratings, where Trump's approval rating has actually gone up and Kamala Harris's has gone down. So I have to wonder if this is not an intended calculation, because they feel like they're concerned that if they introduce her too much, that people might not like what they see. They might revert back to this 2019 opinion of Kamala that got her knocked out of the Democratic primary very quickly. There were some, from reporting, there was apparently Democratic National Committee focus groups ahead of her taking over the top of the ticket, where voters were specifically talking about her laugh as being something they didn't like. That's being rebranded, of course, by the campaign as joy.
Yep.
And Kamala,
Certainly.
I think, said in this interview that she was trying to take this weakness and turn it into a strength. But again, if you have your approval ratings falling, the more that you're putting yourself out in front of the American people, that doesn't suggest that strategy is working. Maybe it is time to try something else, like giving specifics.
Yeah, I mean, although the latest favorability ratings have pinned her at 50%, just above the high water mark, and Trump at 37. I mean, Trump is such a known quantity out there. I think, interestingly enough, too, I would say almost J.D. Vance is probably a little bit too overexposed in doing too many interviews, where then, he says something and has said something during the Senate race, where then they have to go back and qualify it, counter it, address it. But certainly, the vice presidential candidate on the Republican side has been doing these kind of daily press scrums and stuff like that. And we've seen his favorability rating tick down, to your point. So maybe the less, you're on camera, the better. It's just figuring out a happy medium and addressing that high percentage that's still coming out of the debate, as you rightly point, Amber, that want more details, want more information from the vice president with 46 days to go.
Right. I mean, I think separate from a political strategy standpoint, the American people do deserve to know the
Certainly.
specifics of your policy platform. And I think the big sticking point for me is we still have not really heard what the big political conversion was. We've heard sort of piecemeal that her values haven't changed. She's always supported security at the border, harkening back to her time as a prosecutor. On the economy, it's, well, I was a middle-class kid. Okay, but how did you get from thinking that ICE needed to be rethought and wanting to decriminalize illegal immigration, actually co-sponsoring a bill in the Senate for an electric vehicle mandate, wanting to ban fracking, to now flipping on all of those really major policy positions that are really key in the swing states? People want to know, is this a political calculation, as Bernie Sanders suggested, or
that was a pretty raw
right?
moment from Bernie Sanders.
I know, that was brutal for her.
It was pretty.
Yeah.
I don't think the Harris campaign was necessarily happy with that.
I'm sure they weren't. Or was it
that
real?
statement.
I mean,
Yeah.
did she have some kind of transformation? You don't typically go through major transformations when you're 50 years old, but I mean, I'm willing to give her the benefit of the doubt if she can explain it in a coherent way.
Well, with 46 days to go, hopefully we'll get more answers on that front. But I think we've got some more rising coming up after this. I've covered crazy, but I've never experienced anything like this. That's what the founder of Haitian Times, Gary Pierre-Pierre, told the New York Times recently. His comment follows vitriolic rhetoric that spread like wildfire in the last 2 weeks. In case you've missed it, a rumor about pet-eating Haitians was born out of Springfield, Ohio, elevated by top GOP politicians, including former President Trump in his debate with Vice President Harris just last week. Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, has repeated the false rumor multiple times. For a refresher, here are some of these clips.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there.
Vice President Harris said again today that the, quote, hateful rhetoric over migrants eating pets is what has caused the bomb threats in Springfield. Can you just respond to her latest, please, on this?
I think that's basically my response. Just put that in the paper, loud boos and 2 thumbs down.
Officials in Springfield, including the mayor, sheriff, and even the governor of Ohio, have sought to debunk this rumor. But that hasn't stopped the rhetoric, and it's taking a toll on Haitians in Springfield and beyond. Pierre-Pierre says the onslaught of hateful speech has grown exponentially in the last few weeks, so much so that it has forced him to shut down the comment section of his own newspaper. Since the memes about pets being snacked on have run rampant, Pierre-Pierre says that it has endangered people's lives.
Here to discuss further is Gary Pierre-Pierre, founder and publisher of the Haitian Times. Gary, thank you for joining us on Rising.
Thanks for having me.
Why don't you start by breaking down a little bit of what you feel the climate is right now for Haitians and specifically Haitian reporters, including the ones on your staff?
Well, as you can imagine, it's a very tense situation. Think about you just moved to a new place a year or so, and all of a sudden you find yourself the target of some hate, and you are totally clueless about why. And that's the situation with folks in Springfield, Ohio. As for our staff, it's been really, really stressful because we are journalists. We have a right to do a job. And so one thing you didn't mention was that our editor was doxxed and swatted. After we did a town hall meeting virtually about Springfield, when she got home, a day later, the police came to her door and said that they had a report that someone had been murdered at her location, at her address. And you can imagine she has a family, the stress that's been faced, the situation, and that it's just unbelievable. It is something that we, even as a journalist, as you mentioned, Kevin, in your intro, with the quote that I gave the New York Times, yes, I have covered wars and conflict all over the US and the world. And I've never seen such personal vitriol. And it's really disconcerting that it's happening in Middle America, of all places.
Mr. Pierre-Pierre, I know in the wake of the debate, the representatives and reporters of the Haitian Times reached out to the Trump campaign. I don't assume you likely heard back from them, but I wondered if you could also speak to the former president in his remarks in that Long Island rally this week, saying that he intends to come to Springfield sometime in the next 2 weeks.
Well, I don't think it's a good idea because it's going to be really flaming the situation, making it even worse and much more difficult. And by the way, we're talking about the Haitian residents, but the other residents, their lives have been upended as well. They cannot send their kids to school. They cannot go to houses of worship. Just simply grocery shopping can be problematic, as grocery stores have been evacuated after bomb threats. So I just wish he would just like calm things down as a leader, as a former president, as a wannabe future president. There are certain ways that a head of state, a head of government needs to act. And again, over again, we see the former president has failed the leadership test, and he's about to do that again if he goes to Springfield.
Mr. Pierre-Pierre, we have seen residents in Springfield, Ohio, concerned about the pressure on public resources and some of the jobs. They say they feel that Springfield citizens could have filled some of the jobs that are now being filled by Haitian migrants and refugees. At what point do you think the criticism of the mass influx of Haitian migrants to Springfield is legitimate, and at what point do you think it crosses over into territory that is perhaps harmful to people who have come here through the TPS system?
Amber, let's step back a little bit and look at what and why the Haitians came to Ohio. Ohio had a serious problem. It needed workers. And it asked the federal government under Trump to find its workers. And the Haitians came. Now, the point that you're raising, the problem came because state, county, and federal governments failed to provide Springfield the proper resources to deal with such a large influx. You know, the Haitians' migrations there have really put a huge pressure on social service, schools, healthcare providers, and so on and so forth. But the problem is not that the Haitians are doing anything wrong. In fact, as you know, there are many, many reports, and we've been out there. They have helped to revitalize the city. And so the business community is quite satisfied with the quality of work that they're getting. The Haitians, we're not taking anybody's job. These were jobs that were available that people just didn't want to do.
Well, to be fair, Mr. Pierre-Pierre, I mean, to be fair, it is true, though, that some of the Haitian migrants are working for lower wages because their stay in Springfield is subsidized in part by public benefits, right? So the employers who are saying that they're happy with the work from the Haitian migrants also have to be honest and tell the truth, which is that they are paying them lower wages. Of course, they're happy to do that. The Springfield residents, I think, are troubled by the fact that they would not work for such low wages or lower benefits because they're used to a higher standard, and they don't get the same public benefits that a refugee would. So that's, I think, where the tension is coming from.
Well, I understand, absolutely, you make a point, but there's nothing that the Haitians are getting that any person living in America would not get. They're just getting some help, some healthcare benefits, some SNAP benefits. There's nothing special that the Haitians are getting that other residents aren't getting. But it's a complicated, it's a delicate situation that you've also raised a good point, Amber, about, you know, migrant exploitation, and that exists, and I know about that very well. But at the same time, it's a very difficult situation. But I think that the Haitian presence have not really negatively impacted the residents, native-born Americans' lives, to be quite honest. I mean, I stand behind that because that's the truth.
Mr. Pierre-Pierre, one of the leading Republican voices actually praising so many of these Haitian migrants who've come here is actually Governor Mike DeWine, who wrote in an op-ed today published by the New York Times titled, "I'm the Governor of Ohio. I don't recognize the Springfield that Trump and Vance describe." Interestingly enough, the Republican governor, Mike DeWine, was born in Springfield, lives just 10 minutes away from that community, and he has very strong words of support for many of these Haitian migrants who've come here seeking work. How important is it to elevate some of those voices from within the Republican Party to kind of provide for cooler heads to prevail with all the rhetoric that's been going around?
Well, Governor DeWine has a long history with Haiti. He's been to Haiti many, many times on missionary trips. And so I'm glad he's speaking out. We do need calm voices, reasonable voices. And unfortunately, the too few of the members of the Republican Party have spoken out. And I think it's unfortunate because they know that no matter what the problems are in Springfield, let's address them properly. Let's not use dog whistles and just tropes and these other things that not helping the situation, in fact, is inflaming the situation.
Thank you so much for joining us on Rising, Gary Pierre-Pierre. We appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me.
New York licensed marijuana back in 2021, yet 3 years later, there's only 182 licensed dispensaries in a state with 20 million people. Meanwhile, Politico reports that Michigan, which has half the population, has over 800 dispensaries. Strict eligibility requirements on who could receive a license to open a dispensary, coupled with bureaucratic delays and lawsuits, have hampered the launch of legal stores in New York. The problem is that without enough licensed suppliers to meet the demand, thousands of unlicensed sellers have stepped in to fill the gap. Those unlicensed sellers often skirt rules, for example, setting up shop near schools and selling weed in colorful packaging, Politico reports. In response to the illegal shops, lawmakers gave state and local authorities more power to close those shops. So far, the New York State Illicit Cannabis Enforcement Task Force has padlocked over 1,000 shops. Still, there are likely thousands more still operating, and there are legal challenges threatening to derail the existing enforcement efforts. For instance, a judge recently ruled that one cannabis shop that was shuttered must reopen because officers did not follow proper procedures when they shut it down.
Still, New York City Mayor Eric Adams and New York Governor Kathy Hochul have celebrated the work done so far. Hochul says that shutting down 1,000 plus unlicensed stores is, quote, bringing us closer to our goal of building the strongest, most equitable cannabis industry in the nation. Part of the whole reason for the push to legalize marijuana was the law's racist enforcement history. For example, the ACLU reported that in 2010, black people were 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana than white people, even though both groups consumed marijuana at the same rate. So clearly some issues in the Empire State with this rollout, 3 years in the making, with legalizing marijuana, Amber.
Yeah, and I think this has been fairly consistent among a lot of the states that have legalized marijuana. We saw in Colorado that their projections for tax revenue off marijuana were well below what they anticipated. They expected about 70 million. It ended up being about 40 to 45. They still have an illicit marijuana market because naturally people want to buy it cheaper. They maybe want types of marijuana, strains of marijuana that aren't available in the legal market, or they want something a little bit stronger. So I think a lot of the promises of the legalized marijuana movement have not really been fulfilled, and this New York example is really only the latest one, because the solution that's being proposed here is to either, well, you would have to lower regulations to open up more legal shops, and the question is, do you really want marijuana to be less regulated, considering how high we've seen THC levels spiking in the past 10, 20 years.
And certainly there's a regulatory component with all of this. The fact that I think 182 shops have just opened in the last 3 years compared in the intro that you mentioned that there's 800 legal dispensaries in the state of Michigan. Now they've had it on the books, that law, I think for just a few years longer. Mm-hmm. But with anything, when there's a vacuum like that, and especially not to, Robbie's not here, but channeling his libertarian views, whenever government is involved, it seems like it slows up and gums up the process, which is what we're seeing play out here, I think, in the Empire State for sure.
Yeah, I was just thinking, if only Robbie were here.
You'd have some strong opinions.
Oh, he sure would. In California, actually, which is the largest state market for marijuana in the country, 2/3 of marijuana sales are still on the illicit market. So clearly no one has figured out the right solution to this problem. And again, I just go back to, in my personal opinion, is that it's incredibly difficult for government to get into an industry that has always been an industry of prohibition.
Yeah.
And
That's a really good point.
And sort of backroom, underhanded dealing, especially one that is very heavily controlled by the cartels right now, right? I mean, you have a huge problem with the southern border and the northern border, frankly, being trafficking choke points for drugs, whether it's fentanyl or something
Especially
like
fentanyl,
marijuana,
yeah.
right? And the cartels are not just going to cede control of that market to the U.S. government.
Yeah, I think that totally makes sense. And there's also a political element to this. I think there's a number of ballot initiatives. I think they just confirmed it in Nebraska, which could be critical with that single member district in that state for the presidential race. I know they certified it also in Florida, I believe, for either medicinal or recreational. So there is a political component to all of this as well. We've seen in the past, especially when it was on the ballot in Michigan, we talked about that earlier, where it was recreational. It was actually a boon to down ballot races. In fact, I think in that race, it was Gretchen Whitmer's first race as governor. More people voted on that ballot line and left the ballot box than voted at the top of the ticket for that governor's race. So we know there's a political dynamic too to marijuana politics, certainly in this country.
Yeah, that's true, and that's an interesting point. And we kind of see the same thing with some of the abortion ballot measures in states
really
as well.
Good point.
And you know, going back to the cartel issue, the other problem is not just that the cartels are continuing their illicit trade, but a lot of them are actually getting involved in the legal market. So
That's a really good point
they're
as well,
using subsidiaries, shell companies, paying U.S. citizens to open up these shops, and then
in name
of
only,
course,
pretty much,
right,
yeah.
and then demanding a kickback or effectively controlling it. This was a problem in Colorado. One of my reporter friends went up there and was reporting on this.
And that was
issue.
one of the first states, I think, that
It was.
that for recreational.
It was the
more
first.
than a decade ago,
Yes.
I think. Yeah.
Yep. And the cartels still have a very large percentage of the market there. So again, this promise of, well, you're going to take out the illegal drug dealers, you're going to raise a bunch of tax revenue, and you're going to make it safer. Maybe the third one is true, but the first two certainly haven't been realized.
Yeah, and I think that's where enforcement comes in so much, and especially as you said in the intro, you know, some of these shops are popping up around schools, catering to young people. The packaging alone is especially a play for younger and younger Americans, which is dangerous, right? So hopefully the enforcement element will be stepped up in the wake of all this, and we can cut some of the red tape to bring these more stores online that are safer and regulated.
Yeah, definitely, because I mean, I have a lot of concerns about the rising THC levels in today's marijuana. We have seen links to young people who consume it on a regular basis having a higher likelihood of developing some kind of schizophrenia or other psychiatric condition, which is very concerning. Obviously, there are laws in place for how old you have to be to consume marijuana, but I mean, there's no question that allowing it to proliferate, allowing it in the legal market makes it more accessible for people who might not otherwise have access to it. So that's a concern as well. And you do see, though, on the political front, Republicans being more open-minded about this issue.
It actually kind of makes some strange bedfellows.
Exactly.
In terms of some of these ballot committees are, you know, there's a good number of Republicans that are behind it
right.
as well.
Especially if you have right libertarians, and you even hear some of the more traditional Republicans saying, well, I don't mind if someone smokes it in their own home, but I don't want to smell it when I'm out eating dinner.
Sure, yeah. No, it's a really good point. And to that point too, you know, law enforcement has actually gotten involved in terms of supporting some of these initiatives that are well regulated because of the tax on, you know, local law enforcement, right, enforcing some of these drug laws for minor offenders, as opposed to the ability to really prosecute and go after more serious crimes in different communities.
Yeah, I know we're going to continue to follow this story and the efforts to legalize marijuana in other states, but we're going to take a break and be back with more Rising after this.
It does not represent justice in America when dark money is fueling elections and when the few who have the greatest amount of wealth behind a veil without even presenting themselves or their names manipulate and fuel the election process. That does not represent justice in America. We've got to take that money out of politics.
That was then Junior Senator Kamala Harris, who at the time was vehemently against dark money in politics, even co-sponsoring legislation that would reveal the identities of big donors. But according to new reporting from The Lever, Harris appears to have done an about-face, reaping the benefits from dark money. As the outlet's reporter Helen Santoro reveals, the Democratic nominee has raked in millions from secret donors, including a $20 million contribution from a main donor, Future Forward USA Action.
Harris hasn't been forthcoming about the mega money pouring in, yet she has yet to release the names of her bundlers. Joining us now to dive into all of this deeper is Helen Santoro, reporter for The Lever. Helen, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Helen, I wonder if you could just take a few moments and take us through your reporting in terms of what you have found thus far in terms of campaign spending this cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things my team and I wanted to look into was specifically dark money with Democrats. The wonderful watchdog group, Open Secrets, that looks specifically at money in politics and tracks it, had found that there's been an unprecedented surge of this dark money this election cycle, and that Democratic candidates have been the ones benefiting even more than Republican candidates. So it seemed only fair for us to dive into the presidential Democratic candidate, Kamala Harris. And through looking through FEC records, we found exactly what you said, that there's been tens of millions of dollars donated to the Harris campaign from the dark money group called Future Forward USA Action that donates to the super PAC Future Forward. As typically, you know, dark money, there's a lot of paths to go through before it gets to the campaign. And the super PAC Future Forward was the main one supporting Biden before he dropped out of the race. So we thought that that was pretty big information that needed to be brought to light, particularly given Harris's past, what she said in the past about dark money in politics.
Yeah, that's a pretty big about face. I of course, am wondering about the motivation. Do you think that she just realized running for president is really expensive and maybe she needs the money and isn't too concerned that people such as yourself are going to realize that she said something differently in the past? Has she addressed this at all, or anyone on her campaign?
No, she hasn't, just like how she hasn't revealed the names of her bundlers, which seems to be becoming more and more of a trend in these presidential campaigns. She also hasn't addressed this dark money. And unfortunately, that seems to really be going right in track with the Democrats in general. You know, the party over the years have really decried the power of dark money in elections, saying things just like what Kamala said in that post that you showed at the beginning of this interview, that it's not fair that a group of the real elite rich people can dominate and influence elections, and yet behind the scenes are accepting that exact money from mega donors and these dark money groups. So there's yet to be anything said from the party, the campaign, or Harris about this money that's clearly doing a really good job at fueling her campaign with massive ads and just helping her, it seems like, outspending the Republicans as of now.
Helen, Open Secrets, which you just referenced, has said that a whopping $1.7 billion has already been spent in this election cycle by super PACs already. We're still, just about 7 weeks or so out from this election, so that number is certainly going to increase in these final weeks. I really want to drill down on what you mentioned earlier, that this was usually in the past a purview mostly of the Republicans in terms of dark money spending. Where have you seen that transition where Democrats are trying to compete now for those kind of dollars?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because dark money is so hard to follow, it is just really this innocuous thing happening behind the scenes. But it is interesting that starting in 2010, when Democrats put together the Disclose Act, which is the one that you mentioned at the top, that would require some more transparency from these dark money donors, it seems as if over the past, 14 years, there's been a trend upwards with the party as well in terms of how much money they're receiving from these dark money groups. And now this election cycle are outpacing their other Republican candidates. Like you said, there's still 7 weeks until the election takes place, so a lot can happen within that time. But I don't get the sense from our reporting that the money coming in specifically from Future Forward USA Action, the dark money group, is slowing down anytime soon. They seem really determined to continue funding Harris's campaign. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see a lot more dark money coming into that campaign in the upcoming months.
And if we can go to a little bit more of a 10,000-foot view of general spending in this election, one of the interesting trends we've been seeing on the Republican side is that Trump has garnered support from some of the big Silicon Valley and tech CEOs. How does that newfound support kind of play into this funding race between the two campaigns?
Well, it's interesting you say that because CNN had a really great article that came out not too long ago showing that Harris or the Democrats have also benefited from AI investments in cryptocurrencies. So again, I feel like there's a bit of a narrative of Republicans benefiting from these special interests and maybe not enough focus on the fact that Democrat candidates are doing the same thing. So specifically, CNN reported from previously undisclosed tax records that the Future Forward Action, so that dark money group I keep referring to, their top donors include a husband and wife financial traders with ties to AI investments in cryptocurrency. So these special interests in big tech and AI and a bunch of other industries, they're getting their hands in the campaign races on both sides, very much so. And Democrats have said a lot that, again, decrying dark money, but it seems as if they want to also get those checks from the mega donors to benefit their own campaigns, and so thereby allowing the elite to really sort of tighten their grip around the influence of these presidential elections.
Helen Santoro with The Lever, thank you so much for joining us on Rising. Really appreciate your reporting and helping us get some context on the spending race this November.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you so much for having me.
The race for North Carolina governor just took a very strange turn. A new CNN report alleges that the GOP nominee, North Carolina Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, once posted about his affinity for transgender porn, pro-slavery beliefs, and called himself a, quote, black Nazi. Yikes. Per CNN, in one post on a forum called Nude Africa, Robinson wrote, quote, slavery is not bad. Some people need to be slaves. I wish they could bring it back. I would certainly buy a few. And despite his recent history of anti-transgender rhetoric, Robinson's posts paint a different story. Robinson once reportedly wrote, quote, I like watching tranny on girl porn. And by the way, that's not his first apparent flip-flop. In 2020, he called for a complete abortion ban, but later walked that back when it was revealed he paid for his now wife to have an abortion in the 80s, according to the Daily Beast. On the Nude Africa forum in 2010, Robinson also said he did not care about a celebrity having an abortion and wrote, quote, I don't care. I just want to see the sex tape. CNN's K-File says Robinson was posting on the forum from 2008 to 2012. Robinson, meanwhile, has vehemently denied making the post. Let's watch.
Well, guys, the news media is at it again. My opponent is at it again. You all have seen the half-truths and outright lies of Josh Stein on these ads over and over again. And now a story leaked by him to CNN is appearing now. Let me reassure you, the things that you will see in that story, those are not the words of Mark Robinson. You know my words, you know my character, and you know that I have been completely transparent in this race and before. Folks, this race right now, our opponents are desperate to shift the focus here from the substantive issues and focus on what you are concerned with to salacious tabloid trash. We cannot allow that to happen. And folks, we've seen this type of stuff in the past as well. Clarence Thomas famously once said he was the victim of a high-tech lynching. Well, it looks like Mark Robinson is too, by a man who refuses to stand on stage and debate me about the real issues that face you. Instead, they want to focus on salacious tabloid lies.
Unfortunately for Robinson, CNN's report shows the email address tied to the forum accounts was the same one used for him online and on social media. His location also matched, and he used some of the same unique phrases. The Carolina Journal reports the Trump campaign, who previously endorsed Robinson, has now tried distancing itself from Robinson and asked him to withdraw from the race because of the article. They also asked him to stay away from all Trump and Vance events when they campaign in North Carolina.
It adds up since Robinson was scheduled to speak at a Vance campaign event Wednesday, but his campaign announced he tested positive for COVID and would not be attending. Amber, I'm so happy you were the one to read the intro for this with all of those details. My goodness, just when we think we couldn't be shocked more, in politics, a story like this comes out.
Oh boy. I mean, Robinson has not been a great candidate since the beginning. I think this is probably the nail in his coffin. The previous one was when he, after calling for an abortion ban with no exceptions, him and his wife went out on camera and admitted that she had had an abortion. Gosh, yeah, it's brutal. And from what I understand, according to my sources, the people who recruited him to run had this opposition research, as they often do, right?
I mean, that's just political.
People do,
malfeasance to do that, yeah.
Right. I mean, people do vulnerability studies before candidates run for office. And if you have somebody who's good at their job doing the vulnerability study, then you're going to find things like this. We heard the same thing with George Santos, right? That he was warned that if he ended up winning this race, that a lot of this potentially legal issues would come up, and they did. In this case, I would like to know if Mark Robinson was told that he shouldn't run and he did it anyway, and what exactly the people around him told him when they found out that he had this history of really bizarre porn website comments.
Yeah, it really is incredible if you think about it. Obviously, 46 days left in this race. I think Morning Consult, even before all these details came out, had the race at 50 for Josh Stein, the incumbent Attorney General, longtime Attorney General Democrat of North Carolina, to Robinson's 37%. We know 46 days isn't an eternity in politics. It's a short time, but it's also an eternity. Do you think there's any way that he comes back from this, or is it just the Trump campaign? The Trump campaign is going to be there. The former president's going to be there on tomorrow, actually.
Right.
Do you think he addresses it? Does Mark Robinson even stand a chance of coming back after all this?
Well, if the Trump campaign is smart, they will just stay as far away from possible, not address it. We know Trump's not the most disciplined, so we'll see what happens. But I will say that the polls suggested and the internals that I've seen suggested before this scandal that he's probably going to lose by 10 points, somewhere between 5 and 10 points.
Which is a blowout in a state like North Carolina.
Exactly. So I don't think that it was a particularly competitive race anyway because of the initial poor candidate selection. It's kind of wild that he was lieutenant governor before any of this coming out.
He's not a new face. I mean, he was elected statewide.
Exactly.
And he's the sitting lieutenant governor of North Carolina.
Yeah. So do I think he can come back from it? No. I mean, I don't think he was going to win anyway. So in that sense, I think Republicans were probably already kind of counting this race out. So it's not as big of a blow as if it were a really tight race. But you do have to be concerned about the potential for this to harm up the ballot, right?
And down the ballot too, right?
Sure.
You've got, I think they have near supermajorities in the state legislature for the Republicans. Obviously, you've had a 2-term Democratic governor statewide. I wonder if there's ramifications to your point up and down the ballot. And you've got Laura Trump, who's a North Carolina native, who's the co-chair of the RNC.
Right.
So a lot of eyes are going to be certainly on North Carolina. J.D. Vance was there this week. Obviously, the former president's there tomorrow. I just wonder the ramifications up and down the ballot, to your point.
Right. And the other wrinkle here is that there was a deadline yesterday at 5
really
p.m. for Mark Robinson to drop out of the race, and the Republicans would be able to replace him with a different candidate. He declined to do that. Instead, he came out and issued this statement alleging that this is all false, that it's all lies.
Do you think there was some thought to that timing, releasing all this with that deadline? I think it was yesterday, right? As you rightly pointed out, the deadline.
No, so maybe the people who shopped this to CNN had that in mind.
To kind of force him out right before.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, knowing K-File, I don't think he would have waited if he had this big of a scoop. He would have probably just run it as soon as he had it. So maybe he was tipped off or given some assistance, and that just happened to be the timing that worked out, or the Democrats planned it that way. I don't think CNN did. At least not K-File. I have plenty of qualms with other CNN reporters. I like Andrew Kaczynski. So.
Well, and interestingly enough, I mean, North Carolina is one of these early vote states. I mean, ballots start dropping, I think, within the next week or so.
Right.
I know voting is actually underway today for the first time in Virginia, Minnesota, and South Dakota for in-person early voting. So the election is here, and it's certainly going to be here in North Carolina in the coming days.
Yeah, and this is another reminder that you can't force candidates out. Ultimately,
and you can't shame them out either, seemingly. You know.
Yeah, I mean, obviously with Joe Biden, there were reports that he was threatened with the 25th Amendment. So you can apply a lot of pressure and make it really uncomfortable for candidates to stay in. I don't know if this means the RGA is going to pull money from the North Carolina race. They probably should and put it to use elsewhere in other places.
And you're seeing some Republicans in North Carolina. I think both senators are distancing themselves,
right,
waiting as they should, and up and down, a few House members as well.
Yeah, but I mean, if people really have the political will and want to stay in the race, same thing with George Santos. They will, even if it's to the detriment of themselves, their family, and their party, unfortunately.
Which I think we will see this happen over the next 46 days in North Carolina. I don't think he's moving on from this race, certainly to your point.
No, I don't think so. He seems like he's doubling down, actually. The Clarence Thomas comparison was an interesting one.
Very rich.
Take a break and be back with more Rising after this. The former COVID czar for New York City was caught on tape by YouTuber Steven Crowder admitting to flouting every rule he required New Yorkers to follow. In this hidden camera video, Dr. Jay Varma, the official in charge of New York City's pandemic response, boasts about going to sex parties and dancing underneath a Wall Street bank during the height of the pandemic. Let's watch.
When there were shutdowns and restrictions, it seems like rules for thee, not for me, if you're having sex parties with people in hotels.
I think the idea with all of that was basically, again,
if you're having sex parties and dance parties with 200 people while people there get punished if there are 10 or more at a gathering, or more than 40, and you have a dance party of 500 people, that seems like, my question is, you obviously doing that.
Isn't that true with everything though in life?
No, not everyone's having sex parties when they encourage lockdowns for other people.
No, but there's a million rules.
If you weren't afraid of it, why those policies, my point. But if you're afraid of it, you wouldn't be having sex parties and you wouldn't be having dance parties with 200 people when everyone else is locked down.
No, because I'm saying that it's not...
And not checking for vaccinations.
It's not individual.
Right?
No, those are totally different issues. I mean, I think
you know what I'm talking about.
What I'm trying to get at is the main issue is it's not about individual level risk. It's the same thing as driving.
But it is about you as a government official being the architect of the policy.
So those things are
having sex parties and having dance parties while businesses are being shut down. And New York sees an unemployment that's twice the national average as a result of policy.
During the time, I wasn't going to these dance parties in the first year and a half of COVID. I don't know what you're talking about.
You weren't having sex parties? And then dance parties?
No. My wife and I had a party with like 10 people who everybody got vaccinated. Not vaccinated, everybody got tested and things like that.
It was over 12 people. When the gatherings at that point, you had to do in secret because no one else could gather 10 or more. People were dying alone because they couldn't visit members in the hospital.
He did all of this while ordering New Yorkers to stay home to stop the spread of COVID-19. The undercover video was posted Thursday. Dr. Varma did not dispute it, but claimed that a quote had been spliced, diced, and taken out of context. Wow, Kevin. Rules for thee, but not for me.
Yeah, and we've seen this with so many public officials during the COVID crisis. I think this one is particularly damning in that this was the public health professional in charge of recommending all of these policies. Obviously, you've had politicians, and we talked about Gavin Newsom, we talked about Boris Johnson in the UK, but certainly when you're a public health official charged with protecting the people of the city of New York, which was one of the hardest hit places, to see this is just after the fact is just really awful and troubling.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I remember Dr. Rachel Levine had ordered a similar mandate that New York had in relation to nursing homes where COVID positive patients would have to be taken in, at the same time moving his own grandparents out of the nursing home to get them away from COVID. So there's so many examples. I mean, Gretchen Whitmer's husband was accused of flouting rules related to outdoor activity. Nancy Pelosi with her infamous haircut. It's just, it calls into question all of the conventional wisdom during the first year of the pandemic, because as Steven Crowder says in this video, if you were doing all of these things that you mandated other people weren't allowed to do under the auspice of slowing the spread or saving lives, then did you really believe the science that you told all of us that you were following when you made these regulations?
And it certainly doubles down on the lack of public trust and faith in public institutions, but also public health institutions, which is problematic. Hopefully, we will not encounter another pandemic-like event like this in our lifetimes, knock on wood, and beyond our lifetimes. But certainly the lack of trust and the degradation of trust in public officials when they see activities like this. You know, Dr. Varma said in response, "I take responsibility for not using the best judgment at the time." I mean, if that is not the most milquetoast response to these serious accusations, I'm actually very happy to see there's a Democratic City Council member in New York, Robert Holden, who has pressed for an investigation into Dr. Varma in his office as a result of this. I think it deserves bipartisan condemnation. It can't just be one party or the other. It's got to be this united front, calling into question a lot of these decisions and actions.
Agreed, because what we saw in the video that we played was Steven Crowder confronting Varma about the undercover video. The undercover video itself is incredibly damning.
It's even worse than that
right?
interview on the street.
Exactly. He's sitting, it appears to be some kind of date, and he says, I had to be sneaky to get to these. He uses the term sex parties. Like, he's very open about what he was doing. He admits that it would be very embarrassing if this got out because he was in charge of the New York COVID response. He says, quote, "We went to some like underground dance party underneath a bank on Wall Street. We were all rolling, we're all taking Molly, and everybody's high. And I was so happy because I hadn't done that in like a year and a half." And at that point, of course, New York was still under this vaccine mandate. I remember going up for work at that time and literally got chased through a bar because I didn't flash my card at the entrance. I mean, it was pretty dark times for the city, and to know that this guy who was crafting the policy was out there living it up like nothing was wrong is very disturbing, and you're exactly right. It reduces trust in institutions, and then you have people like Dr. Fauci say, well, I'm the science, it's dangerous that people don't trust us anymore, and I agree to an extent. We should be able to trust our public health officials, but you can't.
When they do the right thing.
Yeah, when they do the right thing.
And don't become total hypocrites as part of this process. You have had some interesting reads throughout this Friday show in terms of rolling in Molly and our conversations about the Lieutenant Governor of North Carolina. But again, I think it is that problematic element of faith in these institutions, faith in public health, because again, when something like this happens again, more and more people are just going to tune out because they don't believe these individuals. And again, to this really lacking in any kind of response by this Dr. Varma character. I hope this follows him throughout the rest of his career because it's dangerous and lives were lost because of it.
And it's so disturbing, too, how there's been such little accountability in the public health bureaucracy for the mistakes that were made and for some of the outright attempts to censor people who were offering a different perspective on how to handle the pandemic. I mean, with the Great Barrington Declaration being censored through the request of government officials on social media, which was, of course, was the declaration suggesting that the most vulnerable population should be doing lockdowns, whereas the rest of people should be free to move about their daily lives so long as they're taking their individual risk into account. And then we have Andrew Cuomo, right? Just last week, he appears in front of Congress to testify about that nursing home mandate. He was not pushed out of office because of his COVID policies. He was pushed out because of a sexual harassment scandal.
Exactly right.
He goes in front of Congress and he tries to blame Trump for his own nursing home mandate, claims that he never edited the document undercounting the deaths when his fingerprints are all over it, and is apparently exploring coming back into politics. So people are not going to be satisfied, I think, until the architects of the pandemic disaster, and especially the hypocrites who didn't follow their own policies, are held to account and are not allowed anywhere near public office ever again.
Yeah, I think we move on so quickly in our society. We were talking, Robbie and I, the other day about just moving on from the Trump assassination attempt.
Oh my gosh, no one's talking about it.
We all had this collective experience with COVID, are past it, and we're just so quickly to move on without, to your point, Amber, the accountability element and learning from our mistakes. Hindsight is always 20/20, right? There are a lot of moving pieces at the time, and wanting to protect as many lives as possible, but there's got to be always a proper accounting to restore faith in our institutions.
Absolutely. We're going to take a break. We'll be back. More Rising after this. We have some breaking news. At least 8 people have been killed and 59 injured after Israel hit Beirut with a strike Friday morning, according to the Lebanese Ministry of Health. Israeli Defense Forces said they launched the latest attack targeting senior Hezbollah commander Ibrahim Aqil. According to reports, he was killed in the blast. Aqil was the principal member of the Islamic Jihad organization, which claimed responsibility for the 1983 bombing of the American embassy in Beirut that killed 63 people, per the U.S. State Department.
Israel's strikes come after Hezbollah unleashed 120 rockets towards Israel just Friday morning. This attack into Lebanon's capital comes after Tuesday's attack when pagers exploded across Lebanon, leaving thousands injured and killing at least 12. The two sides have traded attacks since the beginning of Israel's war with Hamas on October 7th. There have been fears that this back and forth will lead to a wider war in the Middle East. Well, certainly this news is coming quickly, and dynamics are changing really rapidly on the ground. This, of course, has been, Amber, a lot of simmering tension on the northern border. So much of the focus in the wake of the terrorist attack on October 7th has been in the south, in Gaza. But certainly it looks like the world and all of us are pivoting towards that critical northern border with Lebanon.
Exactly. I mean, Hezbollah was originally founded in the 80s in opposition to Israel, and in the immediate aftermath of the October 7th attacks by Hamas, Hezbollah started launching rockets on October 8th into Israel. A significant portion of Israelis were displaced from their homes on that northern strip, which Hezbollah claims belongs to Lebanon. And since then, Israel has mostly been focusing its war efforts against Hamas. But of course, this past week, we saw this massive pager and walkie-talkie attack against Hezbollah leaders and officials. That was probably one of the most surgical targeted attacks that we've seen in the entire breadth of this war.
And one of the most intricate attacks, obviously reporting has shown that they was able to intercept these pagers, these walkie-talkies, somewhere on the supply chain path to insert these devices before they were given to Hezbollah terrorist commanders in the field. Certainly, this would be welcome news, I think, especially for Americans to hear the targeting of Ibrahim Aqil, as you rightly point out, was one of the masterminds of our attack 40 years ago in Lebanon that left 63 individuals, Americans, dead at our embassy there. There has been a bounty on his head levied by the U.S. government nearly since then, since the reporting showed that he was mostly responsible. So I think this is also, if that's the case, welcome news to take a senior military leader like this individual off the battlefield that has targeted Americans in the past.
Yeah, exactly. And I saw some criticism of Israel following the pager attack, alleging that because there had been some civilian casualties, allegedly one of the daughters of one of the Hezbollah leaders died because she had gone to pick up the pager when it rang or something to that effect. And obviously nobody wants children to die in war, but compared to basically every other offensive that's been launched in this war by both Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah, this was the most targeted, probably the least number of civilian casualties, the most sophisticated. And it is interesting that we would blame Israel in their attempt to root out terrorists and not the terrorist potentially putting his family in danger by engaging in those activities. It's sort of like if someone goes to prison for murder, you don't blame the judge who gave him that sentence for separating him from his family. You blame the person who engaged in the actions that led to those consequences.
And certainly one of the main critiques, and you just point out, is the loss of innocent life throughout this entire war since October 7th, and even before then. So I think there are some critiques out there in terms of this precision attack. Questions as to whether the timing of it, right? If it happened midday as opposed to at night, would that have limited some of the loss of innocent life, around these Hezbollah terrorists? But again, this news is breaking. Certainly, there's been 140 missile attacks that are pretty discriminate across the northern border. And we're going to see if there are any avenues towards working through a potential peace issue here, but it doesn't seem likely with this escalation.
Right. I mean, this definitely seems like it would have ramifications for the broader political climate in the Middle East. We know that just last week and the week before, we were told by the State Department and the Biden administration that we were getting closer to a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. How does this impact those negotiations? And then we also know that Hezbollah is aligned with Iran, which has been ramping up escalating its tensions with the United States as well. There have been reports that Iran was behind hacking of the Trump campaign, giving those materials allegedly to the Democratic National Committee, kind of similar to what we saw with the RNC and Russia and Hillary back in 2016. And then also allegedly trying to plot an assassination attempt of Donald Trump. So what does this mean both for the U.S. domestically, as well as with its foreign policy between Iran and Israel and all of these Middle Eastern countries, and then in the Middle East, between all of these disparate groups? Exactly. I mean, there's so many different elements to follow here that we likely won't really see exactly where the posturing is until when we get back here on Monday, I guess. Yeah,
exactly. And again, these updates are coming quickly. I think, it was widely reported, obviously, Secretary of State Blinken was in Cairo the last couple of days working towards that negotiated peace between Hamas and Israel. Those talks are still stalled because of all of these activities, and because, as you rightly point out, Iran is the real puppet master in all of these efforts, playing off all of their allied groups against Israel in a coordinated fashion. But this is also a key priority of the Biden administration. They've got just over, I think, 170 days or so left in the president's term. This has been a key focus to achieve some sort of ceasefire. I think certainly the vice president's camp would welcome that news, but a wider war would certainly be met with, I think, some domestic political response here in this country, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, politically, you would, if you're Kamala, you want a ceasefire before the election because you want to take that issue off of the table. She has said that she is going to continue the Biden administration's policy on Israel, which has kind of rankled some of the progressive base, but maybe endeared her. She's gotten some
flack from progressives.
Sure, certainly. And so maybe that endears her more to Jewish Americans. We'll have to see that. And I mean, certainly over the weekend, we're probably going to see a lot of ramped up tensions in the Middle East that we're, of course, going to continue to follow and cover here on Rising next week. But for now, we're going to take a break. We'll be back with more Rising after this.
Well, it's another day and another problematic story for RFK Jr. This time it centers around a relationship turned personal with a reporter. Independent journalist Oliver Darcy reports that New York Magazine placed its star Washington correspondent Olivia Nuzzi on leave after learning she allegedly engaged in a romantic relationship with RFK Jr. In a statement, New York Magazine said, quote, "Recently our Washington correspondent, Olivia Nuzzi, acknowledged to the magazine's editors that she had engaged in a personal relationship with a former subject relevant to the 2024 campaign while she was reporting on the campaign, a violation of the magazine's standards around conflicts of interest and disclosures. An internal review of her published work has found no inaccuracies nor evidence of bias. The magazine is conducting a more thorough third-party review." The magazine's editor told staff their relationship began in December of 2023 and ended in August.
In her own statement to Darcy, Nuzzi said earlier this year, the nature of some communication between herself and a former reporting subject turned personal. Quote, "The relationship was never physical, but should have been disclosed to prevent the appearance of a conflict. I deeply regret not doing so immediately and apologize to those I've disappointed, especially my colleagues at New York." A representative for Kennedy, meanwhile, told Darcy that Kennedy only met Nuzzi once in his life for an interview she requested and denied. For context, Nuzzi has worked for New York Magazine since 2017 and has gained a reputation for her sharp political features and deep sources. In November 2023, she wrote a profile on Kennedy titled, "The Mind Being Politics of RFK Jr.'s Spoiler Campaign. He Could Turn the Presidential Race Upside Down." Deep sources indeed, Kevin.
Indeed, Amber.
So this is an interesting story because you go back to 2015, Olivia tweets that people are being weird by suggesting that female reporters have intimate relationships with their sources. And now here we are. She claims that the relationship was never physical, which obviously raises a lot of questions about what the nature of the relationship actually was. But there's new reporting actually this morning breaking that her and her fiance have apparently called off their relationship.
Well, that would be some breaking news with this story, certainly. And to your point, I think there's more questions than answers at this point. If it's the case that they only met in person once, the entire nature of this relationship is certainly under question, whether it was just a closeness that came through personal communications and things like that. But certainly, not welcome news for RFK Jr., who left the presidential race just a few weeks ago, obviously endorsed the former president. And seemingly every headline associated with RFK has been another weird situation involving a bear or a whale or now a New York reporter.
Yeah, I think the only real victim here is his wife, Cheryl.
The wonderful actress, Cheryl Hines.
In Olivia's profile of RFK Jr., she apparently met him when they went on some kind of hiking trip, or she went hiking with him, and she writes in the piece, "Poor Cheryl," but it was in reference to RFK's friendships with conservatives and cozying up to Trump. But there's obviously a different meaning to that, "Poor Cheryl" now. Olivia has also faced a fair amount of scandal in her relatively short career. I think we're about the same age. She was accused of breaking and entering into Corey Lewandowski's home, where she showed up, knocked on the door, said nobody answered, tried the doorknob and noticed it was unlocked, and decided to actually go inside and take pictures of his entryway before her boyfriend, I believe Ryan Lizza at the time, said, "Hey, maybe that's kind of illegal and you shouldn't do that," and she left. Then she's in this relationship with Ryan Lizza, which allegedly started with a weird maybe overlap between when he might have been married to his ex-wife and he has multiple kids with her. They were supposed to be writing a book together. Then, according to sources who talked to, I believe it was The Cut, said that they weren't able to produce the kind of political scoops that would make for a good book. The book was delayed. She is also in trouble with Democrats recently for her report on the alleged cover-up of Biden's mental capacity. So, I mean...
Certainly she's in the news.
Yeah, and it's usually not a good thing when the journalist is the story.
Yeah, and to that point, when the journalist becomes the story, I think that's usually problematic when they insert themselves into their reporting. Do you think this further calls into question the trust that many folks have in journalists and their ability to remain objective when covering individuals in politics or across media or athletics, what have you?
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going to go next, because of course I think it does. And there's always an issue when you have people who are following politicians or public officials around on the campaign trail for years at a time, and they have to see them every single day, and it's almost inevitable that some kind of attachment or personal relationship is going to form. And it's possible that that blunts your coverage of that individual and makes you less likely to ask them challenging questions. Of course, that's not always the case, but it can be. And I think when we see the media having the majority of journalists in mainstream institutions being Democratic donors, being Democratic voters, there is a sort of inherent bias that some journalists might not be intentionally bringing to their reporting, but because they are viewing their sources, their stories through a certain lens, that does color the reporting in a way that to a lot of Americans seems unfair or biased against conservatives.
And there's been an ongoing critique about mainstream media being too cozy to the subjects that they report on. Of course, that's always the conversation that comes up every year during the White House Correspondents' Dinner, right? In terms of the frank closeness between a lot of folks in the media and the people that they're reporting about. But this has also been going on for generations here in Washington in terms of that closeness. Because there is the dynamic of wanting to get that scoop, right? Wanting to work really hard to break news, and those relationships matter. You've broken a lot of news in terms of working with sources and getting close to them, earning their trust. And I think that's an important part of it, but not when it crosses a line, clearly.
Yes, exactly. You always have to draw the line somewhere and make sure that just because you're being polite and fair doesn't mean that you are becoming best friends with this person.
Exactly.
For the record, I have never been friends with a politician, just so you know, and I never would. But yeah, I mean, this is obviously troublesome. It's become very common among some reporters. It is part of the DC game, right? These people want the quid pro quo. In exchange for access, I write nice stories about you. And I think, frankly, we've seen some of this on the Kamala Harris campaign with the media, because it took a couple of months before mainstream media figures really started encouraging her and challenging her to do more media interviews. And I think that pressure should have come way sooner. And I don't have a good explanation for that other than these people have been covering the Biden administration or covering Kamala as vice president and were reluctant to kind of anger her because they want to continue to have that access. Apparently, according to reporting, she and her team were having off-the-record meetings with the media.
I was going to say, yeah,
right?
Quite a bit of engagement off the record,
right?
On
which
Air
doesn't
Force Two
benefit
and stuff like that.
Which really doesn't benefit the American public. It benefits the media.
It colors stories
right?
and things like
it
that.
Colors,
certainly.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not the type of access that the American people would want when you're covering a presidential campaign.
Yeah, certainly more to come out of this story as news is breaking, and we hear from both sides of this issue with RFK and Olivia in the mix. And again, it's always problematic when lines are crossed in terms of coverage, because it calls into question the very nature of reporting in this country.
Yes, very true. All right, that's going to do it for us this week on Rising. Kevin, it was great to be at the desk with you today.
Good to be with you, Amber. This was fun.
Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. We'll see you all next week.